After the family reunion, Richard Hale checked his bank account in the quiet of his sister's cedar house near Bear Lake, Utah, and saw a screen that looked wrong at a glance and worse on a second look. The balance was drained to zero. The savings stripped. The small business account he used to sell repaired tools at the flea market empty like a winter field. For a long breath, he only heard the wall clock and the low hum of the old fridge, then footsteps in the hall and the faint whisper of wind through the screened porch. He tightened his grip on the phone and walked into the living room where his daughter Laura sat with her hands laced tight, and her husband Ethan stood by the stone fireplace with a drink and a smooth grin. Richard said, in a steady voice he used when engines stalled and people panicked, that his money was gone. Every last dollar from the sale of Mary's quilting cabin and the years of careful saving. And Ethan snorted, "We needed it more than you," as if the sentence were a joke and theft were a favor. Richard's fingers trembled, not from age but from anger. He tried to hold like a hot tool with a work glove he no longer wore, and he reached for his old leather bag, the one with insurance papers, a small spiral notebook, and a pen that always wrote on the first try, and said, "Then you won't mind what's coming next." Because he had noticed things the night before, and each small thing sat in his mind like a bright thumbtack on a map, forming a line that pointed to this moment. He had noticed his tablet moved an inch off its usual place on the dresser. The charging cable flipped the wrong way in the port. The microfiber cloth folded different from the way Mary used to fold it. A faint Oreo crumb smear on the corner of the screen that wasn't from him because he had eaten soup, not cookies. He had noticed a whisper of Wi-Fi traffic after midnight when the router light flicked twice, then stayed solid. And he had noticed at 1:12 a.m. a silent phone buzz with an email that read, "New login from recognized device," and then another that said, "Security question answered." A thing that made his chest go cold, because only a person in the house would know that Mary's first car was a blue Nova, and that the dog they had when Laura was 5 was named Pixel. In the morning, before pancakes, he had opened the bank app and watched numbers jump in small blocks like trains switching tracks in the dark. 6 transfers between 11:42 p.m. and 4:15 a.m. 2 internal, 2 to a new account with his name spelled Hale, and 2 outbound to a service he recognized from a newspaper article about people who try to hide money in digital coins. He had not shouted then, because shouting breaks the line of thought and dulls the little details that become proof later. Instead, he had closed the app, dried his hands, and walked to the kitchen where the family gathered by the big window that faces the lake, where the water lay flat and gray under a sky the color of old tin. He said what he needed to say. He watched faces. He saw Uncle Pete's eyebrows jump, saw his sister Ruth's mouth make a small O, saw Emma the niece step closer like a medic called to a spill. He also saw Laura look down into her coffee and not drink. And he saw Ethan tilt back his glass and smirk like a man who believes there is no sheriff on this road. When Richard reached for his bag, Laura laughed a small, broken laugh, and Ethan laughed louder. Because mockery is a way some people try to crowd you off your own ground. But Richard's ground was wide and firm and ran back through years of invoices written in pencil, tractor repairs done right the first time, and a promise to Mary that he would keep the house, fix the roof before snow, and set aside for June's college. He had another detail, too, tucked away like a spare key. The neighbor's grandson, Owen, a quiet boy who fixed computers, had installed a small app on Richard's tablet last year after a phone scammer tried to get his utility bill. The app took a front camera photo every time the passcode failed and wrote down the time and the internet address like a careful clerk. Richard had not opened the app yet, not in front of them, but he had felt it in his pocket like a coin you're sure of. He had also, at dawn, called the bank and told the fraud team to flag every transfer, to freeze what could still be frozen, to push a notice to law enforcement if their system thought this was elder exploitation, because a person can be old and still fast on the right morning. The fraud woman on the phone spoke slowly, asked to keep him on the line, said she would file a priority alert, said a detective might call him back where he was staying. He told her the address. He told her the Wi-Fi name. He read the last 4 digits of his accounts. Then he dressed, shaved, and gathered his bag so that when he walked into this room, he would be ready to speak plain and hold steady. Detective stories say the first minutes matter, and Richard believed that, so he kept time in his head. 20 minutes since he hit refresh, 15 since he told Ethan, 10 since Ethan admitted the heart of it without shame by saying, "We needed it more than you," which, in Richard's mind, translated to a simple note. Suspect does not deny. Suspect asserts entitlement. He watched Ethan's hands. No oil under the nails, expensive watch, phone face down on the mantel. And he watched Laura's hands. Ring twisting, nails bitten, a half-moon bruise he had not seen yesterday on the inside of her wrist. He didn't ask about the bruise yet, because questions need order the way bolts need washers. He meant to lay out the next steps quietly. Show the log, call the bank back on speaker so everyone could hear the transfers read out. Ask who touched the tablet between midnight and 4. And he meant to say, as evenly as a service manual, that moving money from an elder's account without permission is a crime in Utah, that he had filed notice, that the right people were on their way. He had breath ready for the first sentence. "Ethan, if you didn't do this, you will want me to call the police right now." When the house shook with a sudden, heavy bang that rattled the glass and made Aunt Ruth grab the back of a chair. The front door flew open on a gust of lake wind, and boot steps hit the floor as if the sound itself were a warning. And Richard turned toward the doorway with the calm of a man who has done the right thing in the right order, and now will see what comes through that open door. And the door flew open, and 2 uniformed deputies came in first, with hands up and voices calm. "Sheriff's office. Everyone please stay where you are and keep your hands visible." And behind them, a woman in a gray blazer and hiking boots stepped through with a badge on a lanyard that caught the lake light. She had salt strands in dark hair, clear eyes that moved fast, and a small notebook ready. And she said in a steady voice, "Detective Hart, Utah State Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Unit. We received an urgent elder exploitation alert from Zion's Bank tied to this address. Who is Mr. Richard Hale?" And Richard raised his hand without standing, because he knew fast movements make other people nervous. And he said, "I am." And she nodded once and said, "Thank you, sir. First, nobody touch any phones, computers, or the Wi-Fi. We need to preserve devices. We will be respectful, but we have to move quickly so we can stop any money still in transit." And in that simple speech, the room changed from a family argument to a scene. Laura set her coffee on a coaster with a faint clink. Aunt Ruth folded a dish towel like a flag. Uncle Pete lifted both palms as if surrendering to common sense, and Ethan, who had been grinning, laughed a short laugh and said, "This is a misunderstanding. We're family." And Hart looked at him without blinking and said, "Sir, I'll address you in a moment. For now, do not touch your phone." And then she turned to Richard and asked softly, "May I speak with you first?" And he said yes. And she did the small, exact things detectives do. She asked if he felt safe. She asked if he needed water. She asked if he consented to them securing the house electronics while she called the bank fraud unit on speaker. When he agreed, she signaled one deputy to the kitchen router and another to the mantel where Ethan's phone lay face down, and the deputy slid the phone into a silver pouch Richard had never seen before. "Faraday bag," the deputy said to no one in particular, "prevents remote wipe." And Richard thought how many new words a crisis teaches you. Hart put the bank on speaker and gave her full name and badge and the case ID the bank had already generated from Richard's dawn call. The bank specialist, a woman with a calm voice and a Western lilt, read out the timeline. 6 transfers between 11:42 p.m. and 4:15 a.m., 2 internal, 2 to a newly created external account with Richard's name misspelled, and 2 to a digital asset service. The last 2 were in a pending window that might still be clawed back if law enforcement issued an emergency hold. Hart said, "We are on scene. We have the elder present and consenting, we have devices, and we have probable cause to believe the access occurred from this location." And the specialist said she would push a hold and loop in the bank's cyber unit. Hart ended the call and asked Richard, in simple steps, to describe what he had seen since last night, and he told it in order. Dominoes, tea, the router light flick, the email at 1:12 a.m., the morning balance that did not balance with his life. and the sentence Ethan had said like a joke that was not a joke at all. Hart wrote as he spoke and did not interrupt except to fix a time or a detail. And then she asked about devices. Richard pointed to his leather bag and said his tablet was inside and that it ran an app his neighbor's grandson installed that took front camera photos when a passcode failed. Her eyebrow lifted a notch, the first real expression he had seen. "Sir, may I look at that app with you?" she said, and he nodded. And she put on thin gloves and opened the bag with the care of a nurse handling a fragile bone. She powered the tablet, asked Richard to enter his passcode himself, then held it so he could navigate. He tapped the small gray icon, typed a short code Owen had shown him, and a folder opened. 3 small squares under a header marked Night Watch. Hart clicked the first and it was black. A thumb across the lens. She clicked the second and a blue-lit face looked back into the room, jaw tight, eyes narrowed, a man leaning over the tablet on Richard's dresser. The timestamp read 014788. The third photo showed the same face a minute later with the edge of a phone screen reflected in the mirror behind. Richard did not say the name. He did not need to. The room placed it like a chorus. Ethan. Hart did not look up yet. She tapped info and read the IP address the app caught and the last 4 digits of the device ID that had successfully logged in after the failed attempts. She asked a deputy to photograph the screen with his body camera, then used the tablet to export the 3 images to a secure evidence email. Only then did she turn to Ethan and say, "Sir, I'm going to ask you to come sit at the dining table where we can talk. You are not under arrest at this moment. You are not required to say anything. If you choose to speak, do not lie to me. If you prefer not to speak, say so. Do you understand?" And Ethan rolled his shoulders like a fighter and said, "This is ridiculous. He gives us money all the time. It's basically a loan. He forgets things." And Laura said softly, "Dad doesn't forget," and covered her mouth like she had surprised herself. Hart kept her face plain. She asked Ethan for his full name and date of birth, and if the black gaming laptop bag by the bookshelf was his. He said yes, and she asked, "Do I have your consent to examine it for the limited purpose of identifying whether it accessed Mr. Hale's bank accounts overnight?" And when he said no, she did not argue. She nodded and told the deputy to leave it powered off and bagged because she would request a telephonic warrant. Then she turned back to Laura and said in the same calm tone, "Ma'am, I need to ask if anyone pressured you to share your father's security answers." And Laura's eyes filled and then steadied, and she said, "He told me everyone uses their mother's first car. He said it was harmless." And Richard felt the old pain in his hands that comes before a storm. But he kept quiet, because speaking out of turn is how facts get blurry. Hart moved through the next tasks in clean order. She separated the room into small conversations, witness by witness. She asked Aunt Ruth and Emma where they were between midnight and 4. She asked who had slept in which rooms. She had a deputy sketch a quick layout and mark where the tablet normally rested. She asked Richard to show the dresser, and he walked her down the hall past the framed photograph of Mary in her garden. The dresser was clean, the microfiber cloth folded the way he liked, and Hart noticed the faint smudge on the mirror at a height that matched Ethan's shoulder. "We will swab that," she said, and called for a kit. Back in the living room, she made another short bank call and confirmed the emergency hold on the last 2 transfers had taken. She asked the bank to email transaction IDs and device fingerprints. She then placed a call to the county attorney on duty and requested a preservation order for the router logs. Within minutes, a clerk emailed a template. Hart filled in the blanks on her phone with 2 fingers, read the language out loud to make sure Richard understood, and submitted. The deputies, moving with the kind of speed that looks slow, collected the router, labeled ports, and photographed the cables before unplugging. When Ethan reached for the Faraday pouch and said he needed to call his lawyer, the deputy said, "You may call from another device as soon as Detective Hart says the scene is secure." And Hart said, "Sir, you may use the landline in the kitchen. You will be within earshot and you should not discuss facts with anyone except your attorney." And Ethan muttered and walked away with the stiff back of a scolded child. Hart turned to Richard again and said, "I know this is a lot. You did exactly the right things. You called fast. You You saved the alerts, you did not confront alone, and you kept the device with the image log. Because of that, we can likely recover most of what left. We can also protect you going forward." And Richard nodded and looked at Laura and saw a crack in her mask that was not just guilt, but relief. Hart asked one last series of simple questions. Did anyone else know his passcode? Had he written it down? When did he last change it? Where did he keep the list of security questions? And he answered one by one. And when she finished, she clicked her pen and finally let the room breathe. Outside, a wave blew across the lake and broke the flat water into small lines. Inside, the air felt different, organized, as if each word had been placed in a box and labeled. Hart checked her watch and said, "Next, I'll draft an affidavit for a search warrant on the laptop and the phones. While we wait, the bank is freezing the outbound transfers. Nobody leaves. Nobody wipes anything. Mr. Hale, would you like to sit at the table while I write? I'll read it to you before I submit." And Richard said yes, and took the chair at the head because it was his sister's house. But it was his case, and he set his leather bag on the floor by his boot, and he listened to the scratch of Hart's pen and the soft squeak of the swab in the mirror frame. And he thought, with a calm that surprised him, that the loud bang that shook the house had not been the end of anything, but the beginning of the part where truth takes the room back. Detective Hart took the end seat at the dining table and began to write, speaking as she went, so the record stayed clean in everyone's head. Her name, the address, the time, the bank alert, the photograph log from Richard's tablet, the 6 transfers, Ethan's statement that sounded like an admission, and the need to preserve and search the black gaming laptop and the seized phone. She called the on-duty judge on speaker, swore an oath in a level voice, and read the affidavit from top to bottom, pausing only to ask Richard to confirm small facts, a spelling, a time, then waited while the judge asked his careful questions about probable cause and scope. In the next room, the deputies kept the scene quiet, and from the kitchen, the click of the old landline told everyone Ethan was on the call he had demanded. "Attorney only," the deputy reminded, and Ethan turned his shoulder to the wall and lowered his voice. But Hart heard the tone and raised a hand. The deputy stepped to the doorway and said, "Sir, who are you calling?" And Ethan said, "My counsel." And the deputy said, "Name?" And Ethan hesitated. The deputy watched the way cops watch for the small twitch that hides a bigger intent, then nodded for him to finish, and Ethan gave a name that sounded real. Hart, still on mute with the judge, tapped a note anyway. Subject attempted to limit audibility of call. Keep a clean record. When the judge came back, he granted a telephonic warrant to search and seize the laptop, the phone, and any removable media for evidence of unauthorized access, identity theft, and wire fraud. He also authorized pulling the router logs and any connected device records. Hart read the authorization back, got the verbal approval, and dictated the time to the minute. She thanked the judge, hung up, and the room let out the kind of breath people hold for a long stretch of highway. Then the work started in the plain way. Good work starts. The deputy unbagged the gaming laptop, photographed its exterior, and noted the sticker wear on the WASD keys. He opened it and found the screen dark, the machine off. Hart asked Ethan for the password, said clearly that he was not required to provide it, and that refusal would not be held against him. And Ethan smirked and said, "Figure it out." So Hart nodded and said they would take the device to the lab for imaging. She turned to the router and had the second deputy read out the DHCP table before pulling power. The log was simple but clear. At 1:43 a.m., a device with a MAC address beginning BC92 leased an address. At 1:45 a.m., the tablet's MAC renewed. At 1:47 a.m., the router showed a spike in outbound traffic to a known banking IP range. Hart photographed the screen, then bagged the router. The bank specialist called back and said the emergency hold had caught both outbound transfers before settlement, and the new external account under Hale was now frozen. She added that the bank's cyber unit had matched the device fingerprint that approved the transfers to a browser on the network at the Cedar House, and that one more item existed. A short session entry labeled "Security Questions Changed at 01:53. Richard closed his eyes for a second and then opened them calm. Hart wrote it down and asked Laura if she had ever shared her father's security answers. Laura, looking at the bruise Richard had already seen, said quietly, "He told me everyone uses a mother's first car. He said it was harmless. He said we would pay it back after a flip." And Hart nodded once to show she had heard both the words and the weight. She asked permission to photograph the bruise, and Laura agreed. A deputy took a quick, clean photo with a scale card beside it. Hart then asked Emma and Aunt Ruth to move to the porch with the first deputy to give their short statements. Inside the kitchen, she asked Uncle Pete if he had seen Ethan near the hallway after midnight. He said he had gotten up for water and heard whispering and a soft click like a charger pulled from a socket. Hart thanked him and wrote it down. She kept the order: witness statements, device catalog, log capture, warrant paperwork, custody chain. When she finished the scene checklist, she turned to Ethan. "Sir," she said in the same steady tone, "I'm going to advise you of your rights because at this point we have probable cause to place you under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed. Do you understand these rights?" And he rolled his eyes and said yes and tried to smile at Laura like this was still a family joke. The deputy had him stand, turned him, cuffed him with his hands behind his back, checked fit with a finger, and searched his pockets. They logged a money clip, a folding knife, 2 receipts, one from a gas station, one from a store that lets you buy prepaid cards, and a small USB drive with a skull logo. The deputy bagged the drive and held it up. Hart added it to the warrant list and looked at Ethan. "I'm going to ask you one question, and you can ignore it," she said. "Is there any money moved that is about to leave a platform we can still freeze?" Ethan's mouth tightened. He said nothing. Hart nodded. Silence has its own record. She called the bank again and the digital asset exchange hotline a prosecutor had given her years ago. She recited the case facts and the warrant number and requested a 30-day preservation on any account registered to Ethan's email or phone. While she spoke, the deputy at the table imaged the live RAM of the laptop before shutting it, a fast capture that sometimes keeps the keys that unlock the door later. Hart thanked the exchange rep, then went to Richard and bent to his level so they were eye to eye. "Sir, the 2 outbound transfers are stopped. The internal moves will unwind. The external account is frozen. We will file the paperwork today. You will get most of this back. For the rest, your bank's protection should fill the gap," she said. Richard nodded once, like a farmer checking off rows. He asked one question: "Will Laura be safe?" And Hart answered with facts. A victim advocate would come by that afternoon. A protective order was already in draft. She would ask the judge to include a no-contact term. She would request conditions that barred Ethan from any device that could reach Richard's accounts. Then she stood and looked at Laura. "Ma'am, do you want to make a statement now or at the station?" And Laura, with her voice steady for the first time that morning, said, "Now," and told the short, sad story of how big talk had turned into small freedoms lost. The jokes that cut, the passwords that everyone shares, the way no had turned into a word she used with her face but not her mouth. Hart listened without filing her own opinions over the top. When Laura finished, Hart said, "Thank you," and wrote one last line. Victim reports coercion, bruise photographed, consistent chronology. Outside, a cloud moved and the lake flashed hard and bright. Inside, Hart signaled, and the deputies guided Ethan to the door. He twisted once to look back into the room, aimed his old smirk at Richard, and said, "You won't see a dime." And Richard, who had fixed machines for 40 years and buried a wife without losing his center, said in a mild voice, "I'll see what the truth brings." And the line landed like a small hammer on a straight nail. Hart handed Richard a card with her cell number and the case number in neat pen, gave Laura the advocate's brochure, and told the room the scene was closed. Then she packed the router, the laptop, the USB, and the phone back into labeled bags, snapped each shut, and checked the seals twice because the case did not end here. It would move forward in paper and in careful steps, and she would push it along. As they left, the house did not feel broken. It felt ordered. The loud bang had shaken the walls, but what stayed inside now were names, times, numbers, and a promise that moved like a quiet current. This time, the money would come back, and so would the part of a family that chooses protection over silence. Detective Hart kept the scene tight until the last label was sealed. Then she asked Richard and Laura to come to the sheriff's office to finish statements and sign the forms that would move money faster. The deputies took Ethan out the door and down the steps, read him the transport log time, and put him in the back of the cruiser. Hart drove an unmarked SUV because she liked to keep witnesses away from the sound of a cage door when she could. The drive down from Bear Lake was quiet except for the radio, which crackled once to confirm the warrant had hit the dispatch board and the jail was ready. At the office, Hart guided them through a wide hallway that smelled like floor wax and coffee. She sat Richard at a table with a fresh legal pad and a small recorder, told him she would record to keep facts clean, and pressed the red button, then asked the same simple questions she always asked in the same order. Name, date of birth, address, relation to the suspect, when he first noticed the problem, what devices he owned, whether he had ever given permission to move money, whether anyone had pushed him to share answers. Richard answered without rush, putting each event in a straight row. The email at 1:12 a.m., the 6 transfers, the sentence from Ethan that did not sound like confusion, but like a plan, the app called Night Watch, and the way it caught the face in the blue light. Hart asked him to slow once and repeat the exact wording he used when he said, "Then you won't mind what's coming next," because words matter when a prosecutor writes a charging sheet. When he finished, she clicked the recorder off, wrote the case number on the pad, and slid a victim rights sheet across the table so he knew the process would not leave him behind. A victim advocate named Tessa came in, soft voice, firm hands, and sat beside Laura first, asked about the bruise, asked if there were other marks, asked if she felt safe going home. Laura said she did not want to go back to the apartment they shared. Tessa nodded and said they could file for a temporary protective order right now by video with a magistrate, and they could list the apartment as a place he could not return to or approach. While they set up the call, Hart walked the tablet to the digital lab down the hall, handed it to a tech named Alvarez, and watched him photograph the device, note the serial, and write the chain of custody line in neat block letters. He imaged the storage to a forensic drive and generated a hash string that looked like scrambled metal. He opened the exported Night Watch folder and confirmed the 3 photos and their timestamps matched the log Hart had already captured at the house. He pulled the tablet's network history and marked the midnight window. When Hart returned to the interview room, Tessa had the magistrate on a small screen, and Laura spoke in a steady voice that tried to be smaller than it was. She told the judge about passwords turned into jokes, about the way money moved without asking, about the bruise photographed that morning and the fear that felt like walking on glass. The magistrate asked 2 clear questions, signed the temporary order, and said a deputy would serve Ethan at the jail before release could ever be considered. Hart called the jail immediately and logged the service request. She then phoned the county attorney and read the probable cause summary: elder financial exploitation, identity theft, unlawful access to a protected computer, and attempted money laundering through a digital asset platform. The attorney asked if the outbound funds were frozen. Hart said yes. Emergency hold in place, exchange preservation requested. The attorney told her to prepare a probable cause statement for booking and to request bail conditions that barred any contact with Richard or Laura and any device access related to their accounts. Hart wrote the statement in simple blocks: what the bank saw, what the app captured, what the router log showed, what Ethan said. She did not add color. She did not need it. The facts were bright enough. When she walked it to booking, Ethan was in a bench cell staring at the floor. He looked up and tried the grin again. Hart did not return it. She read the rights a second time, handed the statement to the sergeant, and noted the time. Back in the lab, Alvarez called out from his screen that the quick memory capture from the laptop had paid off. There was a browser session key in RAM that, with the warrant, would let them view the bank's session details without brute forcing a password. There was also a screenshot saved to a temp folder, a sloppy mistake, showing the bank dashboard with Richard's name cropped but not gone. Alvarez tagged it and added it to evidence. He found a text file with the misspelled external account, Hale, and a short list of numbers that looked like a plan for splitting transfers to avoid alarms. Hart printed the target list and wrote intent in the margin. The bank specialist called again and said the clawback on the last 2 wires had posted to suspense and would credit back after the paperwork hit that afternoon. She also confirmed that the new external account had been opened from a device on the Cedar House Wi-Fi within minutes of the first failed tablet login. Hart thanked her and asked for a signed affidavit from the cyber team. While calls moved, Tessa walked Richard through small shields he could put up today. A fraud alert with the credit bureaus, a security freeze until the case closed. New bank credentials delivered in person at his home branch, a 2-factor key fob instead of phone prompts, transfer limits capped low, and a verbal password on his accounts that only he and the branch manager would know. Richard wrote each step in pencil in his small spiral notebook and checked them off as they made the calls together. He did not rush, and because he did not rush, he did not miss anything. By mid-afternoon, the prosecutor had filed, the judge had set a first appearance for the next morning by video, and pretrial services had flagged the case as a high-risk financial control matter, which meant any release would carry tight rules. Hart briefed Richard and Laura in plain words. What happens tonight? What happens tomorrow? Who calls whom? When the bank funds may post back? How to save every letter and email? She also told them that a detective would escort Laura to the apartment to collect essentials while the order was fresh and Ethan was locked. A deputy named Cole took that task and promised to move slow and keep his body camera running the whole time. Before they left the station, Hart asked Richard if he had questions left. He had 2. He wanted to know if calling at dawn truly changed things, and if a person like him could ever be too prepared. Hart said yes to the first without hesitation, because time is the one lever people can still control when someone else tries to take their money. And she said no to the second, because preparation is not paranoia when it keeps you safe. She handed Richard copies of the case sheet, the order, and a small card with her cell number written twice in case one copy got lost. Laura hugged Tessa and took a new folder of numbers and a list of counselors who took sliding scale. The sun was still high when they stepped outside. The office flag moved slow in a light wind. In the parking lot, Richard paused and looked at the mountains to the south, like a man checking sky before a drive. He felt tired in the bones, but not broken. He told Laura he would cook stew, and they would make lists at the kitchen table. Back inside, Hart carried the evidence bags to the vault, checked each seal again with her thumb, signed the log, and only then let herself sit and breathe. There was more to do. Finish the lab work order, draft the return on the warrant, send the exchange preservation letter. But the day had taken shape in clean lines. The loud bang had opened the door, the facts had walked in, and now, step by plain step, the case was moving where it needed to go. Deputy Cole drove Laura to the apartment in a marked unit just before dusk, body camera on and policy clear. And Richard followed in his old pickup so he could carry boxes. They parked by the curb while Cole read the protective order terms out loud. Laura could enter with law enforcement to collect clothes, medications, documents, and personal items. Ethan could not be present or contact her by any method, and anything that looked like evidence of the financial crimes had to stay in place for a warrant. Upstairs, Cole announced himself, waited, then used Laura's key. The air inside held the stale smell of a room closed in a rush. 2 dishes in the sink, mail stacked under a magnet that said, "Hustle." And on the coffee table, a clipboard with columns titled Flip Timeline and Investors, names in pencil and arrows to dollar amounts. Cole did not touch the clipboard. He only filmed it in place and asked Laura to take what she needed from the bedroom. She moved fast, but not frantic. Jeans and sweaters into a duffel, a framed photo of her mother wrapped in a towel, a small jewelry box that had been her grandmother's, and the spare work laptop issued by her office. In the dresser, she found an envelope marked Utilities, but inside were passwords on lined paper and a folded sheet with security answers in 2 columns, one labeled Dad, the other blank. She handed it to Cole and said she did not want that in her hands. Cole photographed it and left it on the dresser where he found it because they were not searching, only preserving. In the closet, a small lockbox sat under a shoe rack. Laura did not know the code. Cole filmed it and called Detective Hart to report the items in plain view and the lockbox. Hart was at the lab when the call came, watching Alvarez load the skull logo USB into a write blocker, and she wrote, "Lockbox in closet, plain view, password list on dresser, clipboard with investor columns" in her notebook, because each detail would go into the second warrant. She asked Cole to back out with Laura and Richard as soon as essentials were packed and to lock the door behind them. Downstairs, Richard took the duffel without asking questions, carried it as if it weighed nothing, and they drove back to his house in the valley while the last light slid off the peaks. At the station, Alvarez called Hart over and pointed at the screen. Inside the USB was a portable password manager database with a last open time of 2:03 a.m. There was also a CSV labeled keys that listed emails, nicknames, and two-factor backup codes for several services. The database was encrypted, but the fast RAM capture from the laptop held a fragment of the decryption key in memory, enough to unlock with the warrant in place. Alvarez documented each step, took screenshots, generated hash values, and opened the database. Inside were entries named Zions, Blue Nova, Dad Q, and Hale LLC, with notes that showed attempts to guess security questions and a final entry that matched Richard's bank. Q1, mother first car equals Blue Nova. Q2, first pet equals Pixel. Q3, street where you grew up equals Cottonwood. Spelled right in the list. Hart did not react big. She only wrote knowledge plus intent and the time. The bank specialist called again to report the last two transfers now locked in suspense and the external Hale account frozen. And she added that the Digital Asset Exchange had responded to the preservation request with a form letter that confirmed an account created at 4:02 a.m. with Ethan's email and a phone number ending in 41. And all assets in that account were subject to hold pending a valid order. Hart thanked her, requested a signed affidavit from the cyber team, and then drafted her second warrant for the apartment. Search for evidence of identity theft, unauthorized computer access, wire fraud, and financial exploitation, including notebooks, password lists, prepaid cards, lockboxes, removable media, and any device used to access Richard's accounts. She read it line by line to the on-duty judge by phone, swore again, answered narrow questions about scope, and received the authorization at 8:17 p.m. A patrol team met her at the apartment, announced, entered, and photographed before moving anything. The clipboard, the lined paper with security answers, and the lockbox were right where Cole's body camera had recorded them. The lockbox opened with a common default code, and inside were 3 prepaid debit cards with activation stickers still on, a stack of cash withdrawn in small amounts over weeks, a second USB drive, and a low-cost smartphone with no case. The second USB contained an export of bank statements and a spreadsheet titled Clawback Risk, with a column that read, "Call bank at 8 a.m. say fraud, backup plan," which Hart circled in her notes. The phone, powered off, had a SIM that matched the last 2 digits in the exchange reply. They bagged each item, logged times, and left the apartment as they found it, except for the seized evidence. While Hart finished the inventory, Richard and Laura reached the house in Ogden Valley. They carried the duffel inside, and Richard set a pot on the stove because stew was a way to fill space without talking too much. While the pot simmered, they worked the list Tessa had given them in order. Fraud alerts with the 3 bureaus, a security freeze, a call to the local branch to arrange in-person credential changes in the morning, and activation of 2 small key fobs the bank courier had delivered to the station an hour earlier when Hart called in the favor. Laura set the key fobs on the table like 2 small anchors and said she could breathe better seeing them. Richard wrote each step in his spiral and drew a box beside each one for a check mark. When they were done, they ate. Not much, but enough. Then Laura took the spare room that smelled like cedar and books and left the door open because she did not want to feel closed in. Richard sat by the old radio and called Detective Hart to say they had made it home. Hart told him the second warrant had been served, evidence had been seized, and the bank had confirmed the holds. She said the first appearance would be at 9 a.m. by video, and that the prosecutor would ask for no contact and for device restrictions. She also said, in her steady voice, that speed had saved them money today and order would save them grief tomorrow. He thanked her and said he would be on the line early. Morning came clear and cold. Richard put on a clean shirt, and Laura sat at the table with the laptop from her office to join the video court. The judge called the case, read the charges, and looked into the camera to ask if the defendant understood. Ethan appeared from a small booth at the jail, eyes fixed on the screen, a public defender at his side. The prosecutor laid out the outlines without drama. Bank alerts, device photos, router logs, seized passwords, the preservation at the exchange, the bruise, and the protective order, and asked for bail conditions that protected the victim and the witness. No contact, no devices that could reach their accounts, no financial activity outside his own payroll or basic needs, no travel, and a bond that recognized both flight risk and the risk of further harm. The defense argued for release to work and claimed a plan to repay, but the judge set a cash bond and the conditions requested, made the no-contact term explicit, and signed the order. Laura watched without comment, hands flat on the table. Richard wrote the time beside a small box and checked it. After court, Hart called to say she would deliver copies of the orders and that the bank's suspense credits would likely post to his account within 1 to 3 business days once the paperwork hit. She did not promise more than that, because detectives do not promise what they do not control. She also told Laura that a counselor from the clinic could fit her in that afternoon. They said yes. The rest of the day moved in plain steps. Hart sent the lab the second USB and the phone, filed the search return, and emailed the exchange the signed warrant to freeze and disclose basic subscriber details. Richard and Laura drove to the branch, met the manager in a small office, signed new signature cards, and set a verbal password that was not written anywhere. And the manager set transfer limits so low a scammer would break a toe trying to jump them. Back home, Richard took the blue coffee tin from the pantry, the one Mary used, and labeled 3 envelopes again: roof before snow, June's books, and winter fuel. Because routine is a rope you can hold. In the evidence room at the station, Hart checked seals and logged the new entries, then sat at her desk and started the report that would become the spine of the case. She listed each fact in order with times and sources, because a case that is true should read like a straight road. Outside, the valley light thinned. Inside, everyone in their place kept moving. The bank machines reversing, the lab computers imaging, the court clocks ticking, and an old man at a kitchen table holding his ground with a pencil, a notebook, and the quiet help of people who showed up when he needed them. 2 days later, the case moved from emergency to order, step by step, and everyone kept to their tasks. In the morning, the bank manager from Richard's branch called first. Her voice was clear and careful. She said the 2 outbound transfers that Detective Hart stopped had been credited back from suspense. She said the internal moves were unwound. She read the new balances slowly, so Richard could write them down in his small spiral notebook. Then she explained the last piece. The portion converted to a digital asset would not hit his account until the exchange finished its freeze and return process, but the bank's fraud protection would cover any gap within 10 business days after Hart's affidavit arrived. Richard put a small check mark beside each line. He said thank you. He did not ask for more than she could promise. When the call ended, Laura came from the spare room with a mug of tea and a new set of passwords printed from the manager's secure system. The passwords were long and random. The key fobs sat beside them like 2 small bricks. Laura tested both fobs, one for checking, one for savings. Each time she pressed the button, a short number flashed. Richard read the number out loud and typed it into the phone. The bank app accepted the codes. He said, "That's good," and meant it. At the sheriff's office, Detective Hart started her day in the digital lab. Alvarez had pulled the image of Ethan's gaming laptop overnight and finished the first scan. The results were plain and heavy, like a drawer full of the wrong tools. There were screenshots captured by the laptop itself at 1:54 a.m. and 2:01 a.m. A bank dashboard with Richard's name in the corner. A settings page where security questions had been changed and then changed back, and a draft email to Hale LLC at Proton unsent with the subject funds received. There were also browser tabs for articles on how long before bank reverses a wire, emergency holds, and how to clear device fingerprints. The RAM capture from scene day had preserved a session token that matched the bank's cyber log. Alvarez printed the token string and stapled it to the screenshot set. He also found a small text file on the desktop named fliplan.txt. It showed dollar amounts and arrows next to first names. One arrow pointed to Laura Rent with a question mark. Another arrow pointed to R finder's fee with a percentage. Hart wrote it down without guessing who R was. She would ask later. By mid-morning, the county attorney called Hart to set a meeting. They met in a conference room with fluorescent lights and a whiteboard that still held a ghost of last week's case notes. Hart laid evidence out in a simple line: the alert from the bank, the photograph log from Richard's tablet, the router lease list with times, the screenshots from the laptop, the USB database entries Zions, Blue Nova, Dad Q, and Hale LLC, the clipboard from the apartment titled Flip Timeline, and the second USB with the sheet Clawback Risk. She said the exchange had confirmed an account made at 4:02 a.m. with Ethan's email and a phone number ending in 41. She said the jail's recording system captured one short call Ethan placed after booking to a contact labeled R in his phone, where he said, "It's all on hold. Don't touch anything," before the recording warning cut him short and he hung up. The attorney nodded. He said the case was chargeable without jury guesswork. He would add financial exploitation of an elder as the lead count, plus identity theft and unlawful computer access. And he would include an attempt count on money laundering through the exchange. He also said this: if defense counsel asked for a deal, they would require a plea to the lead count with restitution, no contact, and a bar on handling other people's money. Hart wrote each point in her notebook so she would say the same words later to Richard. After lunch, Hart and Tessa met Richard and Laura in a small victim room with a table, tissues, and a box of plain pens. They went over the plan with quiet voices. Tessa helped Laura add a power company PIN, a mobile account PIN, and freeze locks to both their credit files. Hart explained how jail calls are recorded, how no contact works, and how to call if Ethan reached out through someone else. Laura nodded. She said she had an appointment with the clinic counselor at 3. She said she wanted to leave the apartment keys with the landlord and close the lease. Tessa said the advocate office could help with that. Hart turned to Richard and asked if he would be willing to write a brief victim impact statement now. He said yes. He spoke slowly while Tessa typed. He said he had planned to repair the roof before the first snow. He said the money in his account was for that roof, for a knee surgery scheduled for December, and for his granddaughter's books. He said he had felt foolish for a moment when the balance showed 0 and then steady when he decided to do the next right thing. He said he wanted restitution and he wanted peace. He did not want to see anyone hurt. He did not write anger into the statement. The words were simple. When he finished, Tessa printed it. He read it once, signed it, and put his glasses back in his shirt pocket. While they met, Alvarez called Hart from the lab with one more item. The small no-case smartphone from the apartment had been cloned. It held a single app for the exchange and a set of screenshots. One was a QR code for a new wallet with a timestamp of 4:08 a.m. Another was a balance page that showed .000 at 7:21 a.m., which meant the funds never had time to convert into anything else before the hold. There were also messages in a note app. One note read, "If caught, say it was a loan." Another read, "He's old. He won't push." Hart did not show anger. She said thank you, asked Alvarez to add the images to the evidence set, and hung up. In the afternoon, Hart phoned Richard with the updates, using clear phrases and not crowding him with jargon. She told him the credits had posted from suspense. She told him fraud protection would fill any small gap left after the exchange's return. She told him the attorney would push the case forward and that a plea could come fast or slow, depending on the other side. She told him his early call and the Night Watch app had made the difference. Richard said he understood. He said he was boiling potatoes for stew. He said he had written the words, "Don't rush," "Don't skip steps" at the top of his notebook page and underlined them twice. At 3, Laura sat with the counselor in a small office with calm paint and a window that looked over parking lot trees. She told the truth in a low voice. She said how "we" had always meant him. She said how passwords had become a test of loyalty. She said how saying no had made the air in the room heavy. The counselor nodded and drew a simple safety plan: who to call, where to go, what to do if a message slipped through. They talked about shame and how it does not belong to the person who was used. They talked about the bruise and how photos mattered because courtrooms understand pictures. Laura came out with a handout and a small breath that went all the way down. Near sunset, Hart stood in the evidence room with the vault open while the clerk checked seals. She thought about the quiet work that keeps cases true, the chain of custody log lines, the hashes that match, the dates written in full numbers. She thought about Richard's steady voice and Laura's first clean no spoken in court. She closed the vault, signed the log, and went back to her desk to draft the affidavit the bank's cyber team had asked for, because signed words move money in the same way wires do. She wrote in short sentences. She attached screenshots. She sent it. That night, Richard and Laura ate stew again at the kitchen table. The radio played soft and old. They set 3 envelopes in the blue coffee tin: Roof Before Snow, June's Books, Winter Fuel. Richard added a 4th envelope and labeled it with a single word: guard. He slid $120 into each envelope. He said it felt like planting. Laura smiled without forcing it. She said the house felt safe. Outside, the first stars came up over the valley. Inside, the phone stayed quiet. The new locks clicked, and the small, strong work of protection settled into place like a door that finally fits its frame. In the morning, there would be more calls, more forms, and another status hearing on the judge's calendar. Tonight, there was order, and it held. By the end of the next week, emergency had turned into a steady plan, and everyone followed it like lines on a map. The bank posted the suspense credits into Richard's accounts first thing Monday. The branch manager called to confirm exact figures, and the digital asset exchange sent a short formal notice that the wallet created at 4:02 a.m. Under Ethan's email, and a phone ending in 41 was frozen and would be returned under the warrant within their standard window. Richard wrote each step in his spiral notebook in pencil, checked boxes as numbers landed, and did not guess about what had not landed yet, because guessing is not the same as proof. Detective Hart spent those same mornings turning raw items into clean evidence, transcribing the Night Watch timestamps from Richard's tablet, attaching the router lease log that showed the BC92 device at 1:43 a.m., stapling the screenshot set Alvarez pulled from the laptop where security questions flashed and then were changed back, and logging the second USB from the apartment with the spreadsheet titled Clawback Risk. She also flagged 2 threads to close: the R finder's fee note in the flip plan, and the short jail call to a contact saved as R that ended with Ethan saying, "It's all on hold. Don't touch anything," before the warning banner cut the line. Hart pulled the phone dump index, matched the R number to a prepaid subscriber record, then to a work contact card where Laura had once entered Rick Nolan, Pool League. Hart and a deputy met Rick Nolan in a hardware store parking lot at noon, stood in the shade of a pickup, and asked simple questions. Did Ethan give him prepaid cards to test? Did Ethan ask him to stand up an LLC? Did he agree to move money for a percentage? Rick looked at the deputy's body camera light, swallowed, and said he had bragged at pool about easy flips, but had not moved anything yet. Then opened his glove box and handed over one sealed preed card and a folded paper with Hale LLC scribbled beside a list of names and dollar amounts. Hart took the items, wrote a receipt, and asked him to read a short statement into the recorder. He did, voice flat. She did not promise him anything. She only said to answer calls and not to destroy anything. At the county attorney's office that afternoon, Hart laid the Nolan note beside the rest, and the prosecutor drew a simple line on a whiteboard from Night Watch photos to router log to laptop screenshots to USB database Zion's Blue Nova Dad Q Hale LLC to apartment clipboard flip timeline to Rick prepaid card, then capped the marker and said the case was chargeable without guesswork. He filed an amended information with financial exploitation of an elder as the lead count, identity theft, unlawful computer access, and attempted money laundering through the exchange as supporting counts. And he told Hart to expect a plea discussion because defense counsel had already asked for a meeting. Hart called Richard and Laura with the news in clear words, paused to let them ask what they needed, and answered with facts only. The charges filed, the next hearing dates, the conditions that would be requested again, the restitution process that attaches at sentencing, and the way a plea works. No drama, just elements and proof. The next morning, in a video hearing with a square frame and a judge who read every word like it mattered, Ethan entered a plea to the lead count and one supporting count. The judge asked if he was pleading because he was, in fact, guilty of taking money from an elder without permission and using devices to do it. Ethan, eyes on a point just to the left of the camera, said yes. The judge accepted the plea, set sentencing 4 weeks out to give probation time for a report, kept the no-contact order in place, and reimposed the device and finance restrictions in words so plain a person could not pretend not to hear them. No handling of other people's money, no contact with Richard or Laura, no use of any banking or exchange app except for his own basic account, and no attempt to bypass restrictions through another person. Hart texted Richard a photo of the minute entry and then called to translate the legal lines into the next steps he could feel. There would be a restitution figure. There would be a payment plan that attached to the judgment, even if Ethan changed jobs, and there would be a written order that let the bank finish its return. That afternoon, the exchange processed the freeze and wired the final amount back to the bank under the warrant. The branch manager called with the exact credit and waited while Richard read the numbers back to her. He laid his pencil on the page, drew one last box, and checked it. That night, he and Laura kept an appointment with their own future by inviting family for a do-over. Supper at his place in Ogden Valley. Not a celebration, just a clear line drawn where the old line had been crossed. His sister Ruth brought peach cobbler. Uncle Pete carried 2 folding tables. Emma came with a sack of paper plates, and granddaughter June ran in ahead and hugged Richard around the waist. They ate grilled chicken and potatoes in the yard while the shadows pulled long. And before dishes, Richard stood and spoke in the same steady voice he had used with the detective. We share, we don't take. We ask, we don't guess. We protect each other, we don't mock each other's limits. When someone says stop, we stop. And he set a small sign June had painted on a scrap of wood in bright brush letters. Real family protects. Nobody clapped because it was not that kind of speech. They just breathed like a room with a window opened. After food, June asked about the blue coffee tin Mary used, and Richard brought it out, dented and clean, and set 3 envelopes they had started. Roof before snow, June's books, winter fuel. Then added one more and wrote in block letters, guard, because guarding was now a habit, not a reaction. Laura put a 20 in each and said rules help most when they are written down. While family rinsed plates and told small stories, Hart called from the office to say one last thread had been tied. The exchange's affidavit was signed, and in the file, the lab had finished the phone clone and added the wallet screenshots. The jail had served the updated no-contact order, and pretrial services had installed a basic device monitor in Ethan's rental to flag any banking app install. She thanked Richard again for calling at dawn and for keeping the tablet app that took the photos because early, simple steps had kept years of savings from blowing away. He thanked her and said he would send a note to Owen, the neighbor's grandson, to say the night watch idea mattered. After the call, Richard sat again, listened to June explain how her book envelope would pay for science texts, and watched Laura's shoulders drop in a way that meant the house finally felt like a house. When the last car left, and the porch light threw a soft circle on the steps, he locked the door, checked the small camera by habit, and put the spiral notebook back in the drawer. In town, Hart closed the evidence vault and wrote her final lab request for the second USB, then finished the draft of her sentencing memo with plain lines. Early report, full cooperation, strong documentation, swift recovery, and a requested term that included restitution, no contact, and a bar on handling others' money. Nothing was dramatic now. The case had been loud at the door and then quiet in the work. The next date was on the calendar. The roof estimate was on Richard's table. The bank app opened with a key fob code and closed with a thumb. And the rules of the house were no longer assumed. They were said out loud and posted where everyone could see them. Sentencing came on a clear morning 4 weeks later, and the last steps moved in a straight line people could follow. Richard and Laura sat at the kitchen table with the old radio turned low, clicked the link for the court video, and waited while the clerk called the case. Detective Hart was in a small room at the courthouse with a headset on, her report in a thin binder. The prosecutor spoke first in plain words: elder financial exploitation, identity theft, unlawful computer access, attempt to move funds through a digital asset account, then summarized the proof the way a mechanic lays out parts on a cloth. The bank alerts with exact times, the night watch photos from Richard's tablet showing Ethan's face at 1:47 a.m., the router log with the BC92 device leasing at 1:43 a.m., the laptop screenshots of changed security questions at 1:54 a.m., the USB database labeled Zions, Blue Nova, Dad Q, and Hale LLC, the apartment clipboard titled Flip Timeline, the second USB with clawback risk, the prepaid card from Rick Nolan, and the exchange records confirming an account created at 4:02 a.m. The judge, who looked like a person who had heard every kind of story before, asked if there was a victim statement. Richard read his in a steady voice that did not try to do too much. He said the money was meant for a roof before snow, a knee surgery in December, and his granddaughter's books. He said he had felt foolish for a moment and then decided to do the next right thing. He said he wanted restitution and peace. Laura spoke next and said she had been pressured to share answers, that jokes about passwords had been a mask for control, and that she wanted space to rebuild. The judge nodded, turned to Ethan on the jail screen, and asked if he wished to speak. He said he was sorry in a small voice and that he would pay it back. The judge read the sentence in slow lines so no one would miss a word. A term in custody, followed by supervised release. Full restitution to Richard for the exact amount not already returned. A no-contact order with Richard and Laura for the full term, and after unless they chose otherwise through the court. A bar on handling other people's money. Mandatory financial responsibility classes. And device restrictions that banned any banking or exchange app except for his own basic account. The judge signed the order, and the clerk filed it while everyone watched. Hart texted Richard a photo of the minute entry and said she would bring hard copies later that day. By noon, the bank manager called to confirm the final wire from the exchange had posted, and that fraud protection had credited the small remainder the next day. The numbers matched the ledger in Richard's spiral, box by box. He drew one last box beside Return Complete and checked it. In the afternoon, Hart stopped by the house with a property release form. After the forensic copies, the items were eligible for return, and Richard signed for his tablet. Laura signed for a small set of personal papers the warrant had listed, but that were not evidence. Hart handed them a clean one-page plan she kept for elders after cases close. Keep transfer limits low. Keep the verbal password with the branch manager only. Keep the key fobs in a safe place. Keep the Night Watch app updated, and call immediately if anything feels off. She also thanked Richard for calling at dawn and for keeping notes that matched times like fence posts in a straight line. Richard thanked her back and said he would take a pie to Owen, the neighbor's grandson, because the tablet app had mattered. That evening, Laura closed her apartment lease with Tessa's help, turned in the keys, and moved the last small boxes into Richard's spare room. They set the blue coffee tin on the shelf and checked the envelopes. Roof before snow, June's books, winter fuel, guard. They added one marked surgery and slid a first small bill inside because the date on the calendar did not move just because the case had been loud. The next week, a roofing crew pulled up in a white truck, set ladders, and did the job in a day and a half. Richard stood in the yard with a thermos and watched shingles go down in neat rows, felt the quiet pride of work done right, and paid the invoice at the branch with the manager watching while he used the new fob. Laura started counseling every Tuesday at 3 and came home with handouts that were short and useful. She found a new place to rent on her own with a lease in only her name. She also called the college bookstore and priced June's fall list. The numbers did not scare her anymore. They were just numbers, and she had a plan. Hart sent a final update by email. Evidence sealed, sentence entered, restitution order filed with a payment schedule attached to wage withholding. At the lab, Alvarez printed the last hash report and put the binder on a shelf with a label. The case moved from active to closed. The work that kept it true stayed in the vault. On a Saturday with light wind and a sky clear as glass, Richard drove Laura back to his sister's cedar house at Bear Lake. They brought brushes, a gallon of bright white paint for the trim, a small can of oil for the screen door hinge, and a bag of sandwiches. They announced themselves the way Deputy Cole had taught them, out of habit more than need, and went room to room, not to search, but to make things right where the wrong had started. They wiped the smudge on the hallway mirror, the one Hart had swabbed. They patched a nick in the baseboard where a chair had scraped on the day of the loud bang. Laura taped window edges and painted until the house face looked awake. Richard took the old screen door off, cleaned the spring, oiled the hinge, and put it back so it closed with a soft click instead of a slam. They ate at the porch table and looked at the lake where the wind cut small white lines across the blue. Laura said the sound of a door flying open used to make her chest tight, and now it made her think of help walking in. Richard said sometimes a bang is the start. They locked up, checked the windows, and wrote a small card they taped by the coat hooks. Lock devices, double-check transfers, speak up at the first wrong feeling, call the bank, call each other. Back at the house in the valley, the rhythm turned normal and stayed there. Richard kept his morning walks slow and long, wrote bills in pencil, used the key fob, and listened to the old radio. Laura started bringing home fresh bread from a small bakery near the counselor's office. June came on Sundays and talked about science class and how many books fit in the June's Books envelope. A week later, a letter came from the court with a printed copy of the restitution order and a note about victim services if anything changed. Richard put the letter in a folder labeled Case and slid it into the drawer with the spiral. He did not keep it on the table. The table was for stew and maps and small plans like fishing just because, written on a scrap under the coffee tin. Hart called one last time to say she was closing her report and to remind Richard that he could contact her anytime if a message came his way that looked like a crack in the order. He said he would. She said to enjoy the quiet. When the call ended, Richard stood on the porch and looked at the mountains. The roof was new. The door closed right. The numbers in the account matched the ledger, and the rules were written and hung. The loud bang that had shaken the house was part of the story now, but not the whole story. The whole story was the list of plain steps taken in the right order by people who did their jobs. A bank clerk who moved fast, a detective who wrote clean, a lab tech who captured what mattered, a judge who spoke slow, a daughter who said no and meant it, and an old man who reached for his bag and for his phone and said, in a voice that held, "Then you won't mind what's coming next," and meant help, and meant truth, and meant that what he and Mary had built would stand.